the 17th of January 1944. Schweinfurt, Germany. The morning broke grey and cold over the industrial heart of Bavaria. In the operations room of the Reich Air Ministry's Southern Command, General-Lieutenant Adolf Galland stood before a wall-sized map studded with coloured pins, each one representing a Luftwaffe squadron, a fighter group, a defence position. His fingers traced the western approaches, where intelligence reported another massive formation building over England. Outside, the distant hum of air raid sirens had become as regular as church bells. Inside, the smell of stale cigarette smoke mingled with the metallic tang of fear that no one acknowledged aloud. Galland's adjutant entered, carrying the latest production reports, and as the general's eyes moved down the columns of figures, 32 fighters lost yesterday, 19 the day before, 41 the week prior, a simple arithmetic began to form in his mind. An arithmetic that did not balance. An arithmetic that whispered of something the Reich's planners had never truly calculated. That across the Atlantic, in a nation they had dismissed as soft and industrial but not martial, factories were performing miracles that made German production look like the work of village blacksmiths. The pins on Galland's map told one story. The reports from his pilots told another. But neither told the full truth of what was happening in 1944 as the third winter of war against America ground forward. The full truth lay not in the skies over Germany, but in places like Willow Run, Michigan, and Camden, New Jersey, and the sprawling Kaiser shipyards of Richmond, California, places where the American industrial machine had transformed itself into something history had never witnessed, something the German High Command had catastrophically misjudged. When Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States on the 11th of December 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, he did so with the confidence of a man who believed he understood his enemy. America, in the Nazi assessment, was a mongrel nation, weakened by democracy, divided by race, and softened by prosperity. Its military was small, smaller than Romania's in 1939. Its people were pleasure-seeking, accustomed to comfort, unsuited for the brutalities of modern war. Yes, American industry was vast, but industry alone did not win wars. Will won wars. Ideology won wars. Blood and iron won wars, and in these currencies the Wehrmacht believed itself unmatched. The Germans had studied American intervention in the First World War and drawn lessons that now, in retrospect, appeared tragically incomplete. They noted that America had taken over a year to deploy significant forces to France in 1917 and 1918. They observed that even then, American units had relied heavily on French and British artillery, aircraft, and tanks. They calculated that a nation which had demobilized so completely after 1918, reducing its army from 4 million to barely 100,000, was not a nation with the cultural disposition for sustained martial effort. They were not alone in this assessment. In Tokyo, Japanese strategists had made similar calculations. In Rome, Mussolini's advisors had concurred. Even in London and Moscow, there were doubts about whether American democracy, for all its industrial might, could be converted into military power quickly enough to matter. What none of them fully grasped was that American industry in 1941 was not the same beast it had been in 1917. The interim decades had seen the refinement and perfection of mass production techniques that had only been nascent during the First World War. Henry Ford's assembly line innovations, Frederick Taylor's time motion studies. The entire apparatus of American manufacturing had spent 20 years learning to make products automobiles, refrigerators, radios, faster and cheaper than any economy in human history. And now, with stunning speed, that apparatus was about to pivot toward a singular purpose. On the 6th of January 1942, less than a month after Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt delivered his State of the Union address to Congress. The goals, he announced, seemed to border on fantasy. America would produce 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943. It would build 45,000 tanks in 1942, 75,000 in 1943. It would construct 8 million tons of merchant shipping in 1942, 10 million in 1943. When Roosevelt's speech reached Berlin, the initial reaction in the corridors of the Reichstag was derisive laughter. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels called the figures typical American bluster. Military planners in the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht filed the numbers away with skeptical annotations. Surely these were aspirational targets, propaganda for domestic consumption, the kind of inflated promises democracies made to keep their populations motivated. Surely no nation could achieve such production, particularly not one converting from peace to war. They were wrong. By the end of 1942, American factories had produced 47,000 aircraft, not quite Roosevelt's goal, but close enough to shock anyone paying attention. They had built 56,000 tanks and armoured vehicles exceeding the target. The merchant shipping lagged slightly, but the trajectory was clear. And these were just the first-year numbers, produced by an industrial base still in the process of conversion, still working out the kinks, still training workers who had never set foot in a factory before. The Germans had built their war economy on the assumption of European dominance, of captured resources and slave labour, of incremental expansion of existing capacity. Their aircraft production in 1942 was approximately 15,000 planes, a respectable number by any historical standard, representing a formidable industrial effort. But it was less than one-third of America's output, and more troubling still, the gap was widening. General Major Erhard Milch, Inspector General of the Luftwaffe, received the intelligence reports throughout 1943 with mounting alarm. The numbers seemed impossible, yet they kept being confirmed. The Americans were not just building aircraft, they were building them at a pace that defied every known limitation of manufacturing. A 4-engine B-24 Liberator bomber, a machine of staggering complexity with 1.2 million parts, was rolling off the Ford plant at Willow Run every 63 minutes by the spring of 1944. Every hour, another heavy bomber capable of reaching deep into Germany. Every day, nearly 40 such aircraft. Every week, enough bombers to replace an entire Luftwaffe fighter wing. The Willow Run facility itself was a structure that would have seemed like science fiction before the war. It stretched more than half a mile in length, covering 3.5 million square feet, the largest single-room factory in the world. Under its roof, an assembly line orchestrated by former automobile engineers moved aircraft fuselages through 74 different workstations. Women who had been housewives 2 years earlier now operated rivet guns and installed electrical systems. Former farmers read blueprints and torqued bolts to precise specifications. The entire operation ran 24 hours a day in 3 shifts, a ballet of coordinated labor that transformed raw aluminum into instruments of strategic bombardment with mechanical efficiency. And Willow Run was just one plant, producing just one type of aircraft. In Seattle, Boeing was producing B-17 Flying Fortresses. In Burbank, Lockheed was churning out P-38 Lightnings. In Long Island, Republic was building P-47 Thunderbolts at the rate of 700 per month. Across America, in dozens of cities and towns, the pattern repeated. Each factory was a small miracle of production. Together, they constituted a manufacturing tsunami. German commanders, confronting this reality in 1944, found themselves fighting a new kind of war, a war of attrition, where the attrition worked in only one direction. Luftwaffe ace Johannes Mackie Steinhoff, who flew missions throughout the defense of the Reich, later described the psychological impact. We would fight all day, and through skill and courage we might shoot down 20 or 30 of them. We would land, exhausted, thinking we had accomplished something. And the next day, there would be more, always more. Where did they all come from? We were like men trying to empty the ocean with buckets. The arithmetic was brutal and inexorable. In 1943, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 18,000 aircraft on all fronts. German factories, working at maximum capacity, produced around 25,000 aircraft that year, a remarkable achievement that kept the force numerically stable. But in 1944, as the strategic bombing campaign intensified and the invasion of France added another theatre of aerial combat, German losses exceeded 40,000 aircraft. Production, despite frantic efforts and Albert Speer's reorganization of war industry, reached only 39,000 planes. The force was bleeding out. And every German aircraft lost took with it an irreplaceable pilotman who had months or years of training and combat experience. Every American aircraft lost could be replaced within days, sometimes hours, and often with an improved model incorporating the latest refinements. But it was not merely aircraft. The industrial disparity extended to every category of military equipment, every dimension of materiel warfare. Consider tanks. The German Panther, introduced in 1943, was arguably the finest medium tank of the war, superbly armed, well-armoured, mobile. It was also complex and time-consuming to build. German industry produced approximately 6,000 Panthers during the entire war. The American M4 Sherman, by contrast, was mechanically simpler, easier to maintain, and infinitely easier to manufacture. American factories produced over 49,000 Shermans. When General George S. Patton's Third Army raced across France in the summer of 1944, it did so with the knowledge that mechanical breakdowns and combat losses were inconveniences, not catastrophes. Behind Patton's spearheads lay a logistics network that could replace destroyed tanks faster than the Wehrmacht could count them. German panzer commanders, operating under constant shortages, had to husband their vehicles like precious heirlooms. Every tank lost was a small strategic defeat. Every tank in the repair depot was a gap in the line that might not be filled. Or consider the naval dimension. Germany entered the war with 57 U-boats and built approximately 1,150 submarines throughout the conflict, an impressive construction effort that required sophisticated engineering and precision. Manufacturing. But these submarines faced an impossible opponent in the Atlantic, American shipyards that treated cargo vessels like consumer products. Henry Kaiser's Richmond shipyards, employing prefabrication techniques adapted from construction and manufacturing, reduced the build time for a Liberty ship, a 10,000-ton cargo vessel, from 244 days in 1941 to 42 days by 1943. The SS Robert E. Peary was famously launched just 4 days and 15 hours after its keel was laid, a publicity stunt that nonetheless demonstrated what was possible when American industrial methods met wartime urgency. The Liberty ships were not elegant vessels. British sailors called them ugly ducklings. They were welded rather than riveted, mass-produced rather than crafted, designed for function rather than grace. But between 1941 and 1945, American yards built 2,710 of them. Add to that the victory ships, the tankers, the escort carriers, the amphibious vessels, the landing craft, and the total American maritime construction reached a number that still stuns. Over 5,000 major vessels, aggregating more than 50 million tons. For perspective, this exceeded the combined maritime tonnage of all other nations, belligerents and neutrals, Allied and Axis combined. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet, understood earlier than most what this meant. In 1943, he calculated that his submarines needed to sink merchant vessels faster than Allied shipyards could replace them, approximately 700,000 tons per month. His U-boats never came close. The peak month was November 1942, with roughly 700,000 tons sunk, but by mid-1943, improved Allied anti-submarine tactics, escort carriers, and long-range patrol aircraft had turned the Atlantic into a graveyard for U-boats. Meanwhile, American shipyards added vessels to the merchant fleet so rapidly that by 1944, transatlantic shipping capacity exceeded pre-war levels despite 3 years of submarine warfare. Dönitz was fighting mathematics. Mathematics won. A German staff officer, captured in France in late 1944, provided a revealing glimpse into how Wehrmacht commanders perceived this industrial imbalance. During interrogation, he was asked about German strategic planning. His response, preserved in Allied intelligence files, carried the weight of bitter recognition. We knew America was industrial. We expected production. What we did not expect, what we could not imagine, was that production would become a weapon itself. You did not just build armies. You built armies and then built replacements for the replacements. You overwhelmed us not with better soldiers, though your soldiers were good, but with infinity. We were fighting against infinity. That sense of fighting infinity manifested in countless small moments that accumulated into strategic despair. A Wehrmacht artillery battalion in Normandy, pinned down by American counter-battery fire, expending its last shells with no prospect of resupply, watching American guns fire thousands of rounds with apparent unconcern for ammunition conservation. A Luftwaffe pilot, returning from a mission with his aircraft shot to pieces, learning that there were no replacement parts, and his fighter would be cannibalized to keep two others flying. A U-boat crew, sitting in their berthed submarine while their sailing was postponed indefinitely for lack of torpedoes, while above them, Allied aircraft patrolled with radar sets and depth charges, hunting without pause. The German military had been designed for quick, decisive campaigns, blitzkrieg. The entire Wehrmacht structure assumed short wars, knockout blows, enemies that would collapse before resource disparities became determinative. It was a doctrine born from Germany's geographic and demographic reality, a country surrounded by potential enemies, unable to win long wars of attrition against larger coalitions. The strategy had worked in Poland, in France, in the Balkans. It had nearly worked in Russia, but it had no answer for an enemy that converted attrition into arithmetic, that treated war as a production problem, that approached conflict with the mindset of an engineer optimizing an assembly line. By 1944, the gap had become existential. The United States produced 96,000 aircraft that year. Germany produced slightly over 39,000. The United States built 17,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. Germany built 19,000, a comparable number, until one noted that Germany was also fighting the Soviet Union, which was producing 29,000 tanks of its own, largely equipped with American trucks, American aluminum, American radios, American food, shipped via American vessels. The United States launched merchant shipping totaling 7 million tons. Germany's maritime construction had effectively ceased, its shipyards bombed, its resources depleted, its coastal waters mined. But perhaps the most telling disparity was not in the dramatic weapon systems, but in the mundane essentials of military logistics. The American military ran on trucks, specifically the GMC CCKW Jimmy, a 2.5-ton workhorse of which over 562,000 were built. These trucks supplied American armies across North Africa, up the Italian peninsula, through France and into Germany. They carried ammunition and rations, replacement parts and medical supplies, mail and propaganda newspapers. They were the circulatory system of American military power, unglamorous but essential. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, still relied heavily on horses. In 1944, the German army employed approximately 1.5 million horses on the Eastern Front alone. These horses required fodder, rest, veterinary care. They moved at 4 miles per hour. They died in the cold. They represented an army from a different century trying to fight a 20th century war. This technological and industrial gap extended into every corner of military capability. American soldiers carried semi-automatic M1 Garand rifles that allowed rapid fire without manual bolt operation. German soldiers carried Karabiner 98K bolt-action rifles, excellent weapons but fundamentally 19th century in design. American forces communicated via portable radio sets, mass-produced by companies like Motorola and Zenith, over 1.3 million SCR, 536 handheld radios alone. German communications often relied on field telephones and wire lines, vulnerable to artillery and requiring physical connections. American combat engineers used bulldozers, graders, and earth-moving equipment, mass-produced by Caterpillar and International Harvester, to rapidly construct airfields, roads, and fortifications. German engineers relied more heavily on manual labor and horse-drawn equipment. None of these disparities, taken individually, was decisive, but accumulated across an entire military apparatus, across millions of soldiers and thousands of miles of front, they created an overwhelming advantage. The American way of war in 1944 was capital-intensive, technology-intensive, and equipment-intensive. It substituted industrial output for manpower wherever possible. It accepted no scarcity as inevitable. When Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, was being planned, American logisticians calculated the requirements and then simply demanded that American industry provide them. 2 million tons of supplies for the initial invasion, 4,000 landing craft, 11,000 aircraft, enough ammunition, fuel, and spare parts to sustain the largest amphibious operation in history. And American industry, with the casual competence of an organization hitting its stride, delivered. For German commanders observing this invasion, the material superiority was crushing not just in its scale, but in its implications. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander of German forces in the West, reportedly told his staff after observing the Normandy beaches, "The war is lost. Look at what they bring to bear. This is not warfare, this is industry." Erwin Rommel, inspecting the Atlantic Wall defenses before the invasion, had requested additional concrete, mines, steel obstacles, artillery. He was told resources were unavailable, prioritized for the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, across the Channel, American and British forces were accumulating supplies at a rate of 12,000 tons per day in preparation for the invasion. The disparity was not just quantitative, it was philosophical. The German military conception was built around quality, tactical excellence, superior fighting spirit, and indeed, man for man, the Wehrmacht in 1944 remained a formidable force, tactically proficient, often well led at the small unit level, dangerous even in retreat. But tactical excellence could not overcome strategic insufficiency. Fighting spirit could not substitute for ammunition. Superior training could not replace destroyed tanks. There is a peculiar mathematics to attrition warfare. The side with smaller resources must achieve a kill ratio that exceeds the production ratio and must sustain that ratio continuously. If your enemy replaces tanks at a 4-to-1 ratio, you must destroy 4 of his tanks for every one of yours lost, consistently, without respite. The Wehrmacht could occasionally achieve such ratios in tactical engagements, particularly in defensive operations, where German tactical doctrine excelled. But they could not sustain it strategically, across all fronts, day after day, month after month. The cumulative weight of American production made sustained favorable exchange rates mathematically impossible. Consider the air war statistics for 1944. The Luftwaffe, defending German airspace, was facing approximately 4,000 heavy bombers and 1,200 American fighter escorts on any given major raid, plus comparable British forces in night operations. To mount effective defense, German fighters might achieve local numeric parity at the interception point, but this required concentrating forces, drawing fighters from other sectors, operating at maximum sortie rates, and after the battle, whether successful or not, the Luftwaffe had to count losses. A bad day might cost 200 aircraft, a good day might cost 50. But there were no days without loss, and every loss had to be balanced against production capacity already strained by bombing, by resource shortages, by the competing demands of the Eastern and Mediterranean fronts. Meanwhile, American aircraft losses, while tragic for the crews involved, were strategically absorbable. A raid that lost 50 bombers, 500 men, tens of millions of dollars in equipment was devastating in human terms, but operationally routine. Those bombers would be replaced within days. New crews, trained in the vast flight schools of Texas and Arizona, would fly them. The campaign would continue without pause. This dynamic created a psychological dimension to industrial superiority. German soldiers, at every level, operated with the knowledge of scarcity. Ammunition was rationed, spare parts were precious. Every tactical decision carried logistical weight. American soldiers, by contrast, operated in an environment of material abundance that was unprecedented in military history. Artillery forward observers called down fire missions without worrying about shell limitations. Tank crews knew that mechanical breakdowns would be rapidly addressed by supply units carrying ample spare parts. Infantrymen discarded damaged equipment, knowing it would be immediately replaced. This abundance was not just a material advantage, it was a morale factor, a psychological reassurance that the home front was fully committed, that the industrial power of the nation stood behind every soldier. There survives a letter, written by a German officer on the Western Front in September 1944, discovered in a captured mailbag. The officer, a Hauptmann commanding a depleted infantry company, wrote to his wife, "We fight well, our men are brave, but we are like artisans competing against a factory. They have everything. We have courage, and that must suffice, but I fear it will not." It did not. By late 1944, the industrial disparity had become so severe that German military planning entered a realm of fantasy. Projects like the V-2 rocket program consumed resources that might have been used for thousands of conventional aircraft or tanks, chasing technological solutions to strategic impossibilities. The logic was desperately seductive. If conventional production could not match Allied output, perhaps technological superiority could offset numerical inferiority. Hence jet fighters, hence super-heavy tanks, hence wonder weapons. But these programs, even when technically successful, could not be produced in numbers sufficient to matter. The Me-262 jet fighter was superior to any Allied aircraft in 1944, but Germany built only about 1,400 of them during the entire war, and operational numbers never exceeded a few hundred. Meanwhile, American factories were producing conventional fighters at a rate of thousands per month. The contrast was stark. America fought with proven, mass-produced designs that were good enough, but available in crushing numbers. Germany increasingly fought with sophisticated, cutting-edge equipment that was excellent but scarce. In a long war, quantity had revealed itself as a quality all its own. There is a moment, captured in German military records, that crystallizes the realization. In November 1944, during a strategy conference at the Führer's headquarters, General Heinz Guderian, then Chief of the General Staff, presented updated intelligence on Allied production capacity. The figures showed American industrial output continuing to increase even in the fifth year of European war, even as millions of American men served overseas. German production, despite Speer's frantic efforts, was beginning to decline under the pressure of bombing and resource exhaustion. Hitler, according to stenographic notes, dismissed the figures as defeatism. But other officers present later recalled the silence that followed Guderian's presentation, a silence of recognition, of understanding that the war had moved beyond tactical solutions or strategic brilliance, into a realm where industrial capacity was determinative and the outcome was no longer in doubt. The American achievement was not merely one of production volume, though the volume was staggering. It was an achievement of systemic efficiency, of organizational capability, of economic mobilization. The United States had taken an economy oriented toward consumer goods and converted it to war production without significant decline in civilian living standards. American citizens in 1944 ate better, lived better, than their counterparts in any other belligerent nation. There was rationing, certainly, but it was mild compared to the deprivation in Europe or Asia. Defense spending consumed over 40% of GDP, yet unemployment had vanished and wages had risen. The entire structure of American society had been mobilized, but mobilized in a characteristically American way through incentives and organization rather than coercion, through profit motives and patriotism working in tandem, through an industrial culture that had spent decades perfecting the art of making things efficiently. German observers, studying this phenomenon, struggled to comprehend it. The National Socialist ideology held that democracies were weak, that egalitarian societies lacked the discipline for total war, that only authoritarian states could truly mobilize national resources. Yet here was America, democratic and decentralized, outproducing the Reich by margins that defied Nazi theory. The disconnect between ideology and reality created cognitive dissonance in the German leadership. Some, like Speer, began to understand that they had fundamentally misread American society. Others, like Hitler, retreated into denial and fantasies of wonder weapons. But perhaps the most profound misunderstanding was not about capacity, but about character. The Germans had seen American consumer culture, the automobiles, the Hollywood films, the jazz music, the advertising, and mistaken it for softness. They had not understood that the same industrial culture that produced consumer abundance could, when mobilized, produce military power on an unprecedented scale. They had not grasped that the organizational principles underlying mass production standardization, interchangeable parts, assembly line efficiency, were as applicable to bombers and tanks as to refrigerators and cars. They had not recognized that a society which had democratized consumption might also democratize destruction. In this sense, the American soldier of 1944 was not just equipped differently than his German counterpart. He represented a different social contract, a different relationship between citizen and state. He was backed by a nation that provided abundantly for its military, not through aristocratic privilege or totalitarian command, but through industrial capability and democratic mobilization. Every sea ration he ate, every round he fired, every gallon of fuel his vehicle burned, represented a connection to American factories and farms, to workers and farmers who were not coerced but mobilized, not enslaved but employed. The German soldier, by contrast, fought for a regime that had promised mastery but delivered attrition, that had claimed racial superiority but found itself overwhelmed by the mongrel democracy it had dismissed. The psychological impact of this reversal cannot be fully measured, but it permeates German accounts from late 1944 onward, a growing awareness that the war's outcome was no longer tactical but inevitable, that fighting continued not toward victory but toward some less defined end, that the industrial might they faced was not merely quantitatively superior but represented a different order of national power. On the 16th of December 1944, Germany launched its last major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. It was a desperate gamble, throwing the final reserves into a surprise attack through the Ardennes, hoping to split Allied forces and capture Antwerp. For a few days, shock and weather gave German forces local success, but then American industrial power reasserted itself. The weather cleared, allowing aerial resupply. Within a week, entire American divisions were redeployed, from quiet sectors moved by truck convoy hundreds of miles, in a logistical feat German commanders could only envy. Ammunition and fuel flowed to embattled units. Replacements filled depleted companies. The bulge was contained, then compressed, then eliminated. And when it was over, the Wehrmacht had expended its last operational reserves, men and equipment that could not be replaced. The Americans had suffered heavily too, but within weeks, those losses were made good. Fresh divisions arrived from the United States. New equipment flowed from the ports. The war continued, and only one side had the means to sustain it. A German veteran of that battle later wrote in his memoir, "We advanced in captured American trucks, wearing captured American winter clothing, eating captured American rations, because we had none of our own. We fought with the last of our ammunition against an enemy that seemed to have infinite supplies. When the offensive failed, we retreated on foot, because we had no fuel, and we knew, this is the end. Not because we lacked courage, because we lacked everything else." What Germany faced in 1944 was not simply an enemy but a system that had converted democracy and capitalism into instruments of war with unprecedented efficiency. The American arsenal of democracy was not a slogan, but a reality, a fusion of political will and industrial capability that produced military power at a scale that rendered traditional calculations obsolete. Generals had always understood that logistics mattered, that armies marched on their stomachs, that campaigns required supply. But what America demonstrated was something beyond traditional logistics. Industrial warfare as total system, where production capacity became as important as battlefield tactics, where manufacturing efficiency was a strategic weapon. When the war ended in May 1945, American forces had been in combat in Europe for less than 3 years. In that time, American industry had produced 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 3,000 naval vessels, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, 2.6 million trucks, 660,000 jeeps, and mountains of supplies sufficient to equip not just American forces, but to substantially supply British, Soviet, and other Allied armies. The numbers still stagger. They represent the greatest single industrial effort in human history, achieved while maintaining the world's highest civilian standard of living, and accomplished largely by a workforce that included millions who had never worked in factories before the war. German commanders who survived to witness the occupation found themselves confronting the physical evidence of what they had fought against. American supply depots stretched for miles, stocked with equipment in quantities that seemed almost wasteful. Motor pools contained hundreds of vehicles, maintained and ready. Ammunition dumps held more ordnance than the entire Wehrmacht had possessed at any point in the war. The contrast with German deprivation was absolute. Here was the material manifestation of the industrial gap, rendered visible in endless rows of supplies, in the casual abundance that American forces took for granted. General Siegfried Westphal, who served as Chief of Staff to Rundstedt, later reflected in his writings, "We knew intellectually that America was rich, that American industry was large, but we did not feel it, did not understand viscerally what it meant, until we faced it in battle. They did not just fight us with better weapons. They smothered us with quantity. They replaced every loss. They supplied every need. They approached war as Americans approach everything as a problem to be solved with resources and organization, and we had no answer to that. But perhaps the deepest recognition came not from generals but from ordinary German soldiers who became prisoners of war and experienced American captivity. In POW camps in France and Germany, captured Wehrmacht soldiers received rations that exceeded what they had eaten in their own army. They saw the casual efficiency of American logistics, the abundance that provided not just for American troops, but even for captive enemies. They heard the stories from guards about life in America, about supermarkets and automobiles, about ordinary workers who owned homes and cars. And slowly, the propaganda image of America as weak and decadent began to crack, replaced by a more complex recognition. That perhaps strength came in forms their ideology had not acknowledged, that prosperity and power were not contradictory but complementary, that the very things they had been taught to despise about democracy, its messiness, its materialism, its commercial culture were sources of tremendous capability. There is something almost tragic in the German miscalculation, a kind of ideological blindness that prevented clear sight until too late. They had built an entire worldview around the primacy of will, of blood and soil, of martial virtue. They had convinced themselves that modern industrial society weakened men, that comfort bred weakness, that only hardship forged strength. And then they encountered an enemy that was both comfortable and strong, that combined prosperity with power, that fought not despite its industrial character but because of it. The cognitive dissonance this created in Nazi ideology was profound and irresolvable. In the end, what defeated Germany was not any single weapon or any particular battle, but the cumulative weight of American production sustained over time. It was the B-24 rolling off the Willow Run line every 63 minutes, hour after hour, day after day. It was the Liberty ship launched every 8 hours from Kaiser's Richmond yards. It was the Sherman tank, the GMC truck, the M1 Garand rifle, each produced in numbers that made losses acceptable and replacement routine. It was an entire nation converting its economic power into military capability with systematic efficiency. It was, in the most profound sense, industrial civilization itself mobilized for war. The German commanders of 1944 found themselves fighting an enemy they had never truly understood. They had prepared for battle, for tactics, for operational maneuver. They had not prepared for arithmetic. They had not anticipated that war could become a production problem, that victory could be achieved not through superior fighting but through superior manufacturing. They had expected many things from America, perhaps reluctant soldiers, perhaps hesitant strategy, perhaps eventual intervention. What they got instead was a flood of equipment so vast that it redefined what war meant in the industrial age. And so those coloured pins on Gallen's map, each representing a dwindling fighter squadron, told only part of the story. The real story was being written in places he could not see and had not sufficiently imagined in the factories of a nation that had taken democracy and capitalism and forged from them a weapon more potent than any ideology. The story was written in production numbers that mounted like a tide, inexorable and overwhelming. The story was one of commanders who expected war and encountered industry, who planned for battles and faced systems, who trusted in will and discovered that in modern war, resources and organization could be will made manifest. In the grey morning light of January 1944, as Galland studied his map and calculated the arithmetic of loss, the outcome was already determined. Not by any single battle yet to come, but by thousands of factories already humming, by assembly lines already moving, by a production capacity that had made the impossible routine. The German commanders did not expect this. By the time they understood what they faced, it was far too late to matter. The pins would keep falling from the map, the factories would keep producing, and history would record not just who won, but why and what that victory revealed about power in the modern age.